In the winter of 1944, snow drifted across the fields of Belgium like smoke. The war had entered its most mechanical phase, tanks against tanks, factories feeding the front line faster than men could bury the dead. Among the thousands of crews grinding through the frozen mud of the Ardennes, one stood apart for something few could name. Their M4A3 Sherman, call sign Able 35, was known for firing twice as fast as any other tank in the battalion. Crews joked that it must have been fitted with a secret autoloader. Officers said it was impossible. Mechanics called it a miracle. The truth lay with its gunner, a 23-year-old Californian named Bud Anderson, a farm boy turned soldier and a man whose obsession with mechanical rhythm bordered on the unnatural. He wasn't a typical gunner. Before the war, Anderson had worked at an agricultural machinery shop in Sacramento, where timing belts, pistons, and flywheels were as natural to him as breathing. When he joined the army, he carried that instinct with him, the ability to hear when a machine was out of sync. And the 75mm M3 gun on the Sherman had plenty of ways to fall out of sync. The cannon, mounted in the turret's center, used a hydraulic recoil system, a pair of cylinders that absorbed the blast when fired, slowing the backward slide of the barrel and pushing it forward again into position. Each cycle took roughly 2.5 seconds before the gun could fire again. For most crews, that was the rhythm of combat. Aim, fire, absorb, reload, repeat. But Anderson noticed something the others didn't. The recoil system's pistons never operated at exactly the same rate. Minute variations, temperature, wear, fluid viscosity, caused the gun to return to battery slightly unevenly. That meant a pause, a quarter-second lag that multiplied across engagements into lost time and missed chances. He started experimenting during training in England. When other men drank or played cards, he disassembled the recoil regulator, cleaning it by lamplight, marking the motion of the pistons with chalk lines. He discovered that if the recoil buffer valve was tightened a half-turn past regulation, it changed the timing curve, reducing the backward travel just enough to shorten recovery without destabilizing the gun. The modification was small, almost invisible. It was also strictly illegal under ordnance maintenance rules. The buffer settings were factory sealed to prevent accidental misfires or damage to the mount. Adjusting them voided inspection certification and, in theory, could explode the gun. Anderson did it anyway. If you're enjoying this video, leave a like and subscribe to the channel. It really helps our stories get told. Back to the video. The result was startling. The gun settled faster, the recoil felt sharper, but the aim returned to center in half the usual time. With a trained loader, the Sherman could now fire a second shot before most enemy tanks even recovered from the first. He never told the mechanics, he just kept adjusting. When the Ardennes offensive began in December 1944, Anderson's battalion was part of the 4th Armored Division under General Patton's Third Army, the force tasked with breaking through to Bastogne. The Germans had launched a desperate counterattack, deploying Tigerwaffens and Panther tanks across the snowy forest roads. For the Shermans, it was a nightmare. Their 75mm guns couldn't match the range or armor penetration of German weapons. Most engagements came down to luck and coordination. The first tank to hit usually won. But for Able 35, something different happened. In the first week of the counter-offensive, Anderson's crew destroyed 4 German tanks in 3 days, 2 Panzer IVs, 1 Jagd Panther, and a Tiger that had trapped an American column in the town of Cybre. Witnesses said the Sherman fired like a sewing machine, its gun cycling in a perfect mechanical rhythm. Reports logged the engagement as impossible. Shermans rarely survived head-to-head duels with Tigers. But Anderson's gun fired 3 rounds in under 6 seconds, 2 more than regulation and reload times allowed. The last shot struck the Tiger's side armor just as it turned, piercing the thinner plate and detonating its ammunition rack. No one could explain how the rate of fire was possible. Commanders assumed it was the loader, Private First Class Heller, a strong farmhand from Nebraska, but even he couldn't keep up with the recoil cycle. The truth was that the tank itself was firing faster than anyone thought a Sherman could. Between January and March 1945, the modification spread through whispers. Crews called it Anderson's trick. They didn't know what it was, only that his Sherman seemed to jump the gun. When the battalion was ordered east toward the Rhine, Anderson began teaching trusted gunners what he'd learned. He showed them how to feel the recoil, the subtle timing of metal and hydraulics, the split second between safety and chaos. Some called it superstition, others copied it exactly. The results were immediate. Engagement reports across the 4th Armoured began showing an increase in rate of fire by up to 40%. In a war where seconds meant survival, that was the kind of edge that turned statistics into strategy. By March, the adjustment had spread so widely that ordnance inspectors noticed. One by one, modified guns failed routine checks, buffer pressure too high, valves over-tightened. The official response came fast. Unauthorized tampering with recoil mechanisms is prohibited under penalty of court-martial. Anderson's commanding officer confronted him privately. He didn't deny it. He simply said, "Sir, it works." The officer paused, then looked at the kill records stacked on his desk. He signed the report, equipment satisfactory, and sent Anderson back to his tank. From that moment on, the trick went underground, unspoken, but alive. By the time Patton's army crossed the Rhine at Oppenheim in March 1945, Anderson's modified Shermans led the spearhead. Their guns cycled in rhythm, each shot precise and timed like machinery. Somewhere in the chaos of smoke and steel, a single illegal adjustment had become a doctrine of efficiency, invisible, uncredited, unstoppable. The army would never acknowledge it officially. But every tank crew that lived through that winter owed part of their survival to a mechanic who understood rhythm better than regulation. And soon, his illegal idea would reach beyond the battlefield, into the engineering labs and manuals of a military already preparing for the next war. By April 1945, the last remnants of the German army were retreating through the Ruhr Valley. Roads were jammed with armor, smoke, and bodies. The 4th Armored Division moved like a steel tide, crossing rivers and cutting through towns that barely existed by the time the columns passed. For most crews, the Sherman was a tool of survival, underpowered, under-armored, outgunned by almost everything it faced. But for Bud Anderson and the few men who had learned his secret, the tank was more than a machine. It was a mechanism tuned to perfection. Every shot fired from Able 3.5 was measured like a pulse. Recoil, reload, fire, repeat. A cadence smoother than anything the army had seen in field reports. Other crews fired in bursts, Anderson's fired in rhythm, and that rhythm was lethal. The army's ordnance inspectors never understood why his gun operated faster without jamming or bursting its seals. The answer was buried in physics. When Anderson altered the recoil valve, he didn't just tighten it, he recalibrated the entire damping curve. The shorter recoil stroke meant the gun's return to battery was quicker, but more importantly, the oscillation stopped sooner. In most Shermans, the gun would float for a fraction of a second after recoil, the heavy barrel vibrating against hydraulic pressure. That microscopic motion made the next round slightly less accurate. Anderson's tuning eliminated it. The gun returned to zero and held steady like a piston at top dead center, ready to fire again almost instantly. What he discovered wasn't just speed, it was timing, the synchronization of man and machine. The first major test of his modification came during the push on Kassel, where German 80mm guns dug in along the railway line stalled the advance. Standard procedure called for artillery to suppress the positions, but fog-grounded air support and shelling risked hitting Allied convoys. Anderson's platoon moved forward through industrial ruins, silent, slow, tracking the muzzle flashes in the distance. The first Sherman to fire was Able 3.5. 3 rounds in 8 seconds, each impact bracketing the 88's position until the 4th found its mark. The return fire missed. Within 30 seconds, the gun crew was gone. For that single exchange, the report read, "Enemy artillery neutralized at 800 yards. Friendly losses, none." No one outside the unit knew that the difference had been a valve turned half a rotation past factory limits. By the time the war in Europe ended in May 1945, Anderson's modification had found its way into hundreds of tanks across multiple divisions, passed quietly from crew to crew, explained with vague hand gestures and phrases like, "tighten it till it sings." It was never formally documented, but the evidence was everywhere: smoother recoil, faster return, fewer jams. The ordnance inspectors, realizing something systemic was happening, started running comparative trials on captured tanks. They noticed a curious pattern. The modified Sherman's guns showed less wear despite higher firing rates. It defied logic. But Anderson knew why. The faster return meant less vibration, and less vibration meant fewer microfractures in the mounts. His illegal trick had extended the life of the cannon itself. The findings went up the chain, eventually landing at the Ardennes Proving Ground in Maryland, where engineers tested every weapon that came out of the war. They didn't know his name, but they replicated his results perfectly, by accident. When one engineer over-tightened a buffer valve during calibration, the recoil stroke shortened and the firing cycle improved. They called it the high-pressure return method. The Army Ordnance Department quietly adopted it into post-war maintenance guidelines. They never mentioned that a tank gunner in Belgium had done it first, with a wrench and intuition. The real irony came later, when tank design evolved into a new generation, the M26 Pershing, then the M46 Patton and beyond. These tanks carried guns with recoil systems far more complex than the Shermans: variable damping, pneumatic assist, and automatic leveling. And buried in their blueprints, a line of text appeared again and again. Recoil recovery cycle optimized for shortened return curve. Maintain high pressure setting within safety threshold. Anderson's illegal adjustment had become an engineering standard. He didn't know it. He was already home. In the summer of 1945, Anderson returned to California with a chest of medals, a letter of commendation, and a notebook full of sketches. Inside were hand-drawn diagrams of recoil valves, pressure curves, and notes on heat dispersion under combat load. He never showed them to anyone. He took a job as a mechanic in a small agricultural plant outside Sacramento, repairing tractors and hydraulic presses, the same systems scaled down that he'd once fought a war with. When he heard about the Pershing tanks in the news, America's new post-war armor, he recognized the recoil design instantly. The engineers had polished it, refined it, made it safe. But the core principle was his. He smiled at that, quietly. It was enough. Decades later, military historians would find fragments of the original reports. Somewhere in the files of the 4th Armored Division, a typewritten memo dated March 17, 1945, read, "Notable increase in 75mm firing cadence across several platoons. Possible equipment modification. Further inquiry recommended." The inquiry never came. By then, the war had moved on. The Army's focus shifted to atomic weapons and jet propulsion, leaving behind the small miracles of mechanical improvisation that had kept it alive through the mud and metal of Europe. But to those who'd seen it firsthand, the loaders and drivers who'd fought beside Anderson, the lesson stayed. War wasn't won by regulations. It was won by the men who broke them for the right reasons. Anderson's trick lived on, passed down through generations of tankers as folklore. Crews called it riding the rebound, the art of firing before the recoil finished settling, trusting that the gun would land back on target at the perfect moment. No one could explain how it worked, but in training ranges across the world, young gunners practiced it anyway, trying to find that mechanical heartbeat that separated survival from destruction. Every tank that rolled out of a factory in the decades to come, from the Patton to the Abrams, carried echoes of that rhythm. The official manuals never mentioned his name. But if you stripped the machine down to its hydraulics, you could still feel his logic in the steel. The gun didn't just fire faster, it fired smarter, and that single act of defiance, one mechanic's half-turn of a wrench, had changed the very way armored warfare worked. After the war, America's tanks became laboratories on tracks. The M26 Pershing rolled off production lines just as the last Sherman crews were shipping home. Its 90mm gun was heavier, its armor thicker, and its recoil mechanism far more advanced, a system of hydraulics and pneumatic cylinders that absorbed the cannon's violence like a living lung. To most engineers, it was progress. To men like Bud Anderson, it was evolution. The fundamentals hadn't changed. A gun still fired, recoiled, returned, and waited. Only the tolerances had improved. At Aberdeen Proving Ground, technicians dissected every piece of German and American hardware left from the war. They compared the Tiger's massive KWK-36 gun with the Pershing's and found something odd. The German system, though more powerful, was slower to recover. The American design, through refinements introduced near war's end, cycled faster with less vibration. One engineer noted, "Increased damping pressure at return phase reduces oscillation and improves rate of accurate fire." He didn't know it, but he was paraphrasing Anderson's discovery from a frozen Belgian field 2 winters earlier. The concept became standardized in 1946. Controlled recoil recovery timing. Every post-war tank would feature it. And, from that moment, the future of armored warfare changed quietly and forever. In the early 1950s, when the Korean War reignited the need for tanks in rugged terrain, the Army found itself fighting not in open plains but in mountains, where long-range accuracy mattered more than armor thickness. The 90mm M3 gun on the M26 Patton used a modified recoil system directly descended from the late-war Sherman experiments. It allowed faster, smoother follow-up shots on sloped ground, something the older tanks could never do. Veterans called it ghost recoil. You barely felt it. The gun simply kicked, returned, and was ready again. The official manuals credited no inventor. The improvement was listed as post-war hydraulic optimization. But the soldiers who'd served with Anderson recognized the rhythm instantly. When the first Pattons arrived in Korea, one veteran gunner reportedly said, "She fires like old Able 3.5. The phrase became shorthand across the armored corps. Able 3.5 speed meant synchronization, man and machine operating as one. In 1957, a new idea entered the field, the gyroscopic gun stabilizer. It allowed a tank to fire accurately on the move, a concept thought impossible during the war. Engineers testing the system ran into a familiar problem: lag. When the tank hit rough ground, the stabilizer overcorrected. Shots drifted high, then low. The recoil system couldn't settle fast enough between movements. A junior mechanical officer at the Detroit Arsenal named Lieutenant G. Sanderson proposed a fix, tightening the hydraulic recovery rate so that the gun would recenter faster between shocks. His supervisors warned against it, citing excessive buffer pressure, but he tried it anyway. It worked. His field report used the same phrase Anderson had once written in his notebook: "The recoil must finish clean, the barrel must stop dead, not hum." From that small adjustment came the blueprint for modern two-axis gun stabilization, a system that allows today's tanks, from the M60 to the M1 Abrams, to fire with sniper-like precision while moving at full speed. Anderson's principle had become law. Back in California, Bud Anderson lived quietly. He rarely mentioned the war. His days were spent fixing hydraulic presses and tractors at a factory near Stockton. But even there, his precision found new life. When a defective hydraulic jack began sticking under heat, Anderson adjusted the internal valve just slightly, smoothing the timing of the return stroke. The machine operator stared as the press began cycling perfectly. Anderson only smiled. "Pressure's fine," he said. "Timing's the trick." He was still teaching the same lesson, even if no one knew it. That year, 1958, a visiting Army engineer from the Ordnance Corps came through the plant on an inspection tour. He'd served in Germany and recognized Anderson's name from an old battalion roster. Over lunch, he mentioned the recoil test reports from the war, the ones that had become the foundation for tank gun timing theory. Anderson listened, amused. When the engineer finished, he just laughed quietly. "Yeah," he said. "Sounds familiar." He never claimed it. He didn't have to. As the decades passed, The principle of controlled recoil timing evolved into an entire science of fire control systems. By the 1970s, tanks used sensors, computers, and gyros to calculate the perfect moment of release, the same way Anderson had once done with instinct. Inside those systems, engineers found that even digital control benefited from mechanical harmony. Consistent damping, fast recovery, zero oscillation. The lesson remained the same. You can't compute stability, you have to build it. The US Army's 1978 Stabilized Gunnery Manual included a diagram labeled Ideal Recoil Damping Curve. The line matched almost perfectly the shape Anderson had sketched in his notebook 33 years earlier. No one noticed the connection, but the machines remembered. In 1980, when the first M1 Abrams rolled out of Chrysler's tank plant in Lima, Ohio, its 105mm M68 gun cycled with mechanical perfection. Return to battery time of less than 1.8 seconds, nearly double the efficiency of its WLP predecessors. Its recoil recovery curve was digitally controlled, its stabilization automatic. But deep inside the technical manual, one maintenance note stood out. Maintain buffer pressure slightly above baseline for optimal recentering. Excessive damping may cause lag. The margin of adjustment, half a rotation of the valve. Exactly what Bud Anderson had turned on a Sherman in the snow. That's how his discovery survived, not as a name, but as a habit. Every tank mechanic since has known that the secret to a fast, clean shot isn't power, it's timing. When historians later reviewed field records of late war tank engagements, they found anomalies, Shermans recording shot intervals impossible by manual loading alone. One archivist labeled them statistical outliers. Another looked closer and saw a pattern. The faster Shermans had one thing in common. They'd belonged to the 4th Armored Division. In 1991, when the US Army's Abrams tanks rolled across the deserts of Kuwait during Operation Desert Storm, the gunners fired at moving targets with accuracy unthinkable in 1944. Sand, heat, and speed didn't matter. The guns never drifted off balance. In technical debriefs afterward, engineers noted how perfectly the modern fire control systems managed recoil timing. The return curve is flawless, one wrote. You can fire before the echo fades. That line could have been written by Bud Anderson himself. He never saw the tanks that bore his legacy. He died the same year, quietly, surrounded by family, a mechanic to the end. His toolbox still contained a worn brass wrench, its handle marked with faint scratches from years of careful turns. If you turned it half a rotation, it still clicked like a heartbeat, the same rhythm that once saved lives in the snow. The world that followed the war moved faster than any engine Anderson had ever known. Jet aircraft split the skies where propellers once groaned. Missiles replaced cannons. Computers replaced grease and intuition. Yet somewhere inside all of it, beneath the circuits and code, his logic still lived. Because in every machine, no matter how advanced, there is still rhythm. And Bud Anderson had spent his life listening to it. When historians looked back on the mechanical genius that defined World War II, they found names like Werner von Braun, Oppenheimer, and Whittle, men of laboratories and patents. But the real progress often came from the field, from tankers, engineers, and mechanics who broke the rules to make their machines fight harder and last longer. Anderson belonged to that invisible brotherhood, the ones who tuned the world by ear. In 1992, a retired ordnance historian named Harold Vincent began writing a book on the field mechanics of World War II. He collected obscure accounts of improvised fixes, the welders who turned wreckage into armor, the radio men who rewired artillery sights to guide night fire, and the tank crews who defied the manuals. Among the hundreds of reports, one fragment stood out. A brief memo from the 4th Armored Division, dated March 1945. Improved firing cadence observed across M4A3 units. Local adjustment to recoil valves suspected. Unverified, but effective. Vincent spent months searching for who made that adjustment. The name appeared only once, a line on a maintenance roster for a Sherman listed as Able 35. The gunner's name, CPL C.B. Anderson. He tracked down surviving crew members. Most were gone. One, a loader named Paul Heller, wrote back from a small town in Kansas. Heller's reply was short. "Yeah, I remember him. He said the gun was out of rhythm. Then he fixed it. After that, we never missed." That was all the confirmation Vincent needed. His book, published a year later, carried a single chapter on Anderson. The title was simple: Half a Turn. By the late 1990s, the US Army had digitized most of its historical archives. Among the files was a technical reference scanned from a 1946 Ordnance Research Bulletin. Buried deep in a report on post-war tank improvements was a single paragraph under the heading Experimental Recoil Systems. It read, "Field modification discovered to increase return to battery speed, likely improvised in European theatre. Principle integrated into hydraulic buffer redesign, 1945-46. For decades, no one knew who the field modification belonged to. Now they did. It had a name. Anderson's name never appeared on blueprints or patents, but his fingerprint lay across an entire generation of tank engineering. Every main gun after 1945 followed his principle. The shot must return clean, without vibration, ready before the echo fades. It became a silent law of mechanics, one written not in ink, but in talk. When the first M1 Abrams rolled out in 1992, a tank that could fire, reload, and fire again in less than 4 seconds, its engineers presented it as a marvel of modern technology. They talked about gyros, microprocessors, and laser stabilization. None of them mentioned that its hydraulic recoil timing was, at its core, identical to that of a Sherman tank from 1944, tuned by a farm mechanic who'd ignored a rule and saved his crew's lives. The old and the new were connected by pressure, rhythm, and one act of quiet defiance. Years later, at the US Army Armor and Cavalry Museum in Fort Benning, Georgia, a restored M4A3 Sherman sat under a spotlight. It wasn't Anderson's original tank. That one had been scrapped decades earlier. But the curators restored the recoil mechanism to match his design. Next to it hung a small brass plaque. No portrait, no ceremony, just text. Dedicated to the tank mechanics and gunners who taught machines to keep time. At the bottom, etched into the metal, were 3 words. Half a turn. Most visitors never noticed. But for those who did, veterans, engineers, historians, it was enough. Because they knew that every great machine carries the memory of the hands that made it work. Bud Anderson's life ended quietly, without honors or speeches. He left behind no patents, no memoirs, just a few tools, a faded army photograph, and a worn field manual with his notes penciled into the margins. But his influence never stopped. Today, when modern tank crews calibrate their guns before battle, they check 3 things: sight alignment, gyro balance, and recoil recovery time. The third is measured by milliseconds. The adjustment, if needed, is made by turning a valve, half a rotation past standard. The manuals call it micro-adjustment, mechanics call it feel. And though none of them know where it came from, they're all turning the same wrench, the same motion, the same defiance, the same faith that the perfect machine can still be built by hand. War has a way of burying its miracles. The inventions that saved the most lives rarely make the history books. But history doesn't run on medals or speeches. It runs on precision. And somewhere, under the noise of every modern battle, the rhythm still beats. Fire, recoil, return, ready. The cadence of an idea that started in snow and smoke when a young gunner tightened a valve and discovered that perfection was just a matter of timing. Bud Anderson didn't change the world with force. He changed it with a fraction of a turn. And in doing so, he proved that sometimes the line between chaos and control isn't courage or luck. It's the steady hand of someone who listens long enough to hear the heartbeat inside the machine. Long after the guns went silent, the machine stayed behind. In fields, in museums, in scrapyards swallowed by weeds. The tanks still waited, their steel bones resting in silence. The paint faded, the hydraulics bled dry, but somewhere inside the old armor, the rhythm still lived. Fire, recoil, return, ready. That was Bud Anderson's world, a world of movement, math, and faith. He never saw himself as a hero or even as an inventor. He was just a man who listened to the heartbeat of his machine and refused to accept that it couldn't be improved. The army called his trick illegal. History called it innovation. Every tank that came after, from the post-war Pattons to the roaring Abrams of the modern battlefield, carried his ghost in its design. Every time a gun recentered faster than physics should allow, every time a recoil stopped dead and steadied for the next shot, a trace of his logic pulsed through the hydraulics. Half a turn. That was all it took. A moment of defiance that no one noticed, written in wrench marks instead of ink. A secret whispered from one mechanic to another until it became a doctrine buried in steel. He never asked for recognition. He never expected it. The only proof he ever needed was the smooth kick of the gun, the sound of a shell leaving the barrel, the whisper of balance returning. To him, perfection wasn't an award. It was a feeling, a moment when everything moved exactly as it should. Now, when modern crews calibrate their weapons, they don't know his name, but they still follow his rhythm. They still trust the same invisible law that timing beats power, that precision outlasts chaos. Because Anderson's secret was never really about the gun. It was about control, the quiet, stubborn belief that even in war, a single human hand could make the world operate just a little smoother. The men who knew him are gone now. The tanks are museum pieces, the manuals rewritten, the wars changed beyond recognition. But the principle remains. A half-turn past regulation. A moment of patience before perfection. A machine brought into rhythm by the will of one man. He was just a soldier in the mud. But his hands rewrote the heartbeat of an army, and long after the world forgot his name, the recoil still stops clean, the gun still returns true, and the rhythm of Bud Anderson's war still hums quietly beneath every machine that dares to call itself precise. Because sometimes, all it takes to change history is the courage to tighten a single bolt and listen until the steel starts to sing.